Hello, everyone, and welcome to the iSpring Solutions webinar series, where every week we talk about e-learning trends, share iSpring tips and tricks, and cover clients' cases. My name is Paulina. I'm the community manager at iSpring, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. And during this webinar, we will cover a very interesting and important topic. We will learn how to start getting results through e-learning. Finally, right? Just kidding. As a speaker, I have invited a very special guest today.
Oh,
He's a wonderful person. He's a great presenter. He could easily be a tour guide if he wasn't interested in e-learning anymore. And he founded a great company called eLearning Alchemy, where people create digital learning solutions that actually impact business results. Everyone, please meet Clint Clarkson. Hi, Clint. Thanks for tuning in today. And how are you?
good morning. Thank you for having me. I am fantastic. It's a little bit earlier here for me. I'm on mountain time in Calgary, Alberta, but excited to be here and to discuss how do we get results from e-learning.
Wonderful. So, in a moment, I will pass the mic over to you. But before I do that, I would like to go over some technical things. So, I have great news for everyone who, for some reason, can't sit through the whole session. This webinar is being recorded, but guys, I would like to encourage you to stay till the very end of it because it's a great opportunity to address your questions directly to our presenter. But for those of you who need to go, no worries, you will receive a link sometime after the webinar. And also, to address your questions to our presenter, please submit them in the question box. You will find it on the right side of the GoToWebinar panel. And right now on the screen, you should see how this panel looks. Okay, so I think right now I am ready to pass the mic over to Clint, and I'm going to do this right now.
Thank you very much. And give me 1 second to bring up this presentation and I will begin sharing. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I've given this talk a little bit of a new title. I called it the P word, how to make e-learning more effective, and it's probably not what you think. So this discussion today is going to be focused more on a strategic approach than a tactical approach. And what I mean by that is looking at some of the high level things that we need to do before we even get into an e-learning project or when we get into an e-learning project, as opposed to how to set up slides or tell a story or use gamification and those sorts of things. Lots of great webinars and conference sessions and books and blogs and that on those types of topics, but a few less on this topic that I like to call the P word. So let's dive right in. I want to start with a premise, and this sort of shapes the rest of the discussion for the day. And it's important for me to set this up, and you'll see why more momentarily. So the premise is the majority of what L&D professionals produce is a complete waste. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that. So going to launch a poll question here that actually asks you whether or not you agree with this. And ironically, when I discuss this with L&D professionals, I found that most agree with this statement, but none of them believe that it's them. So we've kind of got this ironic situation where we agree that likely there's a lot of what we produce that isn't of high value, and yet none of us think that it's us that's producing it, which becomes problematic. And when that discussion started off, it often shifts sort of the direction of the discussion. So I want to be a bit in your face about this and say I completely agree with this, and in discussing with business executives in all kinds of industries, they agree with this as well. And we don't actually have to look very far to find some anecdotal evidence of this. So we just need to jump into a discussion with we just need to jump into looking at a couple of examples or from our stakeholders. And so want to look at a couple of short little videos from the L&D Scenes comic series. If you wouldn't mind, Paulina, launching the first video, and then we'll come back and discuss it a bit.
Sure. First of all, I will close the poll and share the results
Okay.
that you see right now on the screen. And let me share the video.
The learning objectives slide really helped me feel prepared for the course. Listening to the executives talk for 24 minutes was so inspiring.
I'm glad I had to click 19 times on every slide. Very interactive.
Those multiple choice questions really reinforced what I learned 2 minutes ago.
Those were the most productive 3 hours I spent at work all week.
I'm going to encourage all my peers to take this course right away.
But it's just a bunch of examples of things that e-learners don't say, or individuals that are completing e-learning don't say to themselves or don't say to others. Things like how inspiring it is to listen to an executive talk for long periods of time, or how e-learners love to click on the screen a whole bunch of times to be able to access their content. These just aren't things that our primary stakeholder as the participants, they aren't saying. When we talk with individuals inside organizations that are having to complete our e-learning courses, they're not particularly satisfied with it or happy about it. So this automatically has to raise some sort of a concern with us about the value we're creating when the individuals we're creating it for would rather do their jobs than get paid to not do their jobs and get better at their jobs and potentially improve in their career. So it says something about the value that our learners perceive in what we're creating. And then from our second group, from the executives or from the business leaders, we have this type of challenge.
Good morning. Today's meeting is to finalize our plans to effectively roll out our new software. Let's get updates. L&D, I sent you the details yesterday. What are your thoughts?
It's a lot of very complex changes. We'll need 2 days of training per employee. We can have it ready mid-next month.
We're actually going live next week.
Let's say 4 hours of training per employee. Can we start Thursday?
We only heard of this training yesterday. How are we supposed to be ready by Thursday?
How long does it take to build a PowerPoint?
These are these two L&D scenes, both of them very popular online as far as the engagement and comments they received. A lot of people are experiencing these types of things. And then with this second one, when we have a situation where our leaders aren't inviting us into conversations early because they don't believe we can participate or add value to that conversation. That's the only reason not to be invited. And then the expectation that we can produce things really, really quickly because well, training's not that hard. It's just building a PowerPoint. So there's a lack of understanding and a lack of confidence in our ability to produce, and that's the reason for that premise statement that I'd thrown up a second ago of the majority of what L&D professionals produce is a complete waste. Now, in the poll, we see that 57% of you said yes, you agree with this. 43% of you say no. That actually is a little bit more in favor than normal, the fact that 43% of you say no. But still, we've got almost 60% of the people saying that they agree that it's a complete waste. A lot of what we do is a complete waste, which is problematic. It doesn't matter if it's 60%, it could even be just 30%. If 30% of what we're producing, if 30% of what organizations are paying for is getting thrown out the window or flushed down the toilet, that's a pretty significant problem that we need to address. And so that's the premise that the rest of this is based on. So what's going on? We've got 3 different things that are happening, or at least that I've proposed in the outline for this particular talk. The first one is that I think we're focusing on the wrong things. We are a lot of emphasis right now, a lot of content on focusing on the learner and being learner-centric. And I've said this in a number of talks, and I'll say it again here. It's not that I don't believe that being learner-centric is important. I just don't think it's the most important thing, and you'll find out what I do believe that is in the next couple of slides. The result of that wrong focus is that we get caught in this downward spiral. When we get to that section of the presentation, I'm hoping that will be more of a conversation. And then finally, standalone solutions, which we treat e-learning too often as though it is the solution by itself. And very rarely, I'm going to probably say never, is that actually the case. To that premise question, with the poll being that 43% of you said no, I would love if you would throw into the chat what your thoughts are and why you've said that you disagree, that a lot of the majority of what we produce is a complete waste. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that if you don't mind throwing them in the chat, and then we'll come back to that and have a bit of conversation around that. So let's look at this concept of having the wrong focus. So I want to pose this question to the group. Please reply to the chat. I'll give you a few minutes now. What is the purpose of learning and development? And I'm going to put myself on mute. I give you about 30 or 60 seconds just to answer that question in your own opinion. What is the purpose of learning and development?
Virginia says that saying that what we do is a complete waste is insulting. Catherine also says that if you plan ahead, you can make good training. David says that he doesn't agree simply because he's not in a position to agree.
All right, I'm going to jump back in and feel free to continue adding responses, but definitely want to jump in here and make a couple of comments. But let's start with that first one because it's probably the most important. Virginia, your comment that it's insulting to say that what we produce is a complete waste. And I guess the question becomes out of that is, what do we define as not a waste? And that'll be actually what we talk about in this first section. To not be wasteful, we have to be really clear about what it is that we're supposed to be producing. And that's what the second question is about. What is the purpose of learning and development? And then the comment that if we plan ahead, we can produce training that is effective. And I agree with that. I actually think there's one of the biggest problems that we have, and we'll talk about this in the downward spiral, is that we constantly are being put under more and more pressure to produce more and produce it more quickly. And part of that is because the perception of what we're producing doesn't have enough value. So we should be able to produce it quickly because it's not valuable. So we run into these types of challenges. And ultimately, it really isn't learning and development. It's in our position to be able to make the assertion as to whether or not what we're producing is valuable or is wasteful. It's the organizations that get to make that determination. And by and large, when we talk to executives about their perception of what L&D is producing, they don't believe that they're producing a lot. They don't believe that they're having a meaningful impact on the organization. I read a poll recently that was on a discussion similar to this topic, and it was with executives, and the general consensus around executive groups was that they believe learning and development can influence their organization in a meaningful way, but they don't believe that their L&D department can do it. And so when you have a lot of organizations believing that it could be valuable, but not believing that their teams can do it, it means that they don't believe they have the right people inside the organization. But when all the organizations are saying that, the question is, where are the results coming from? And the last thing I'll comment on quickly is this, the comment on the Pareto principle from Bradley. I agree with you that 20-80 rule is crucially important. Part of the question around that, though, becomes, are we producing 100% to get the 20% that is going to create some value, or are we just finding what that 20% is so that we can get the 80% value? And so we do that in L&D a lot, where we create too much, not always because of us, sometimes because of the organizations, but ultimately we end up producing too much, and that becomes part of the problem. So thanks very much for the comments here. Getting more to this piece about what is the purpose of learning and development, a lot of comments around knowledge transfer, at least the understanding of what that should be, and things like creating paths for people to grow in a company. Let's take a look at this. And I've asked this question a lot in a lot of different formats and haven't really gotten the response I've ever hoped for because the P is always left out. There's a word that starts with P that I affectionately like to refer to as the P word that rarely comes up in these types of discussions. And I want to propose to you that all of the results that you've given so far ultimately lead towards this, but don't necessarily get us right there if we're not focused on it. The P word, as it were, is something that a lot of people are really uncomfortable with. So we hide it. We come up with what are often long-winded, unclear, or buzzword-laden descriptions of our department and our work. And ultimately, we've gotten lost in this mess of learner-centric and all of the different buzzwords that we have in learning and development. So the question that I always have here is, what happens if we clear this up? What happens if we start to focus on the P word? The big thing that comes out of it is that we create clarity, we create consistency, and we create focus, all of which are things that we need if we want to be effective at anything. And most importantly, we begin to align our work with the work of the business, because the P word is profit. Profit is like air to an organization. It is quite literally the one thing that an organization cannot survive without. Yet very few L&D professionals think in terms of profit. We sometimes have discussions around ROI or other business measures, but rarely do we just come back to just the simple question of how do we create profit? And when we ask organizations for permission to take people away from their work under the guise that we're going to produce profit, but then we don't actually do that, we're setting ourselves up. L&D has pulled what is maybe the ultimate bait and switch. We've endlessly promised results. We've delivered almost nothing, if you agree with that initial statement. And yet here we stand still asking for more almost every single day. As an industry, we need to get more focused, and I believe that profit is the starting point. Now, the line to profit from learning and development is pretty simple, or at least we can make it sound pretty simple, because there's only two routes for an organization to get to profit. And the first is to increase revenue. So anything that we can do that increases the organization's ability to bring revenue into the organization is positive and puts us towards profit. The other option is to decrease cost. And same sort of idea. The more revenue we have, the less cost we have, the more profit that we actually create. And so as a department, as working in L&D, our question is, how do we get on either one of those paths? What we often do is that we say that e-learning is on the path to profit. But what we haven't done is done a really good job defining what the steps are getting from the e-learning course into the profit. So I want to pose another question to the group here. We'll put this in. I'm just going to delete the existing responses so that it's a little bit easier to sort. And the question is, what should we do if e-learning isn't on the path to profit? And you may jump in. You actually asked two questions at once now. Sorry, I guess that's from a few minutes ago. I'm just knocking that out. What should we do if e-learning isn't on the path to profit? And I guess fundamentally, you may not agree that it needs to be on the path to profit, so please feel free to respond there. But what do we need to do if e-learning isn't on the path to profit? I'll just give you about 60 seconds to respond to that.
Virginia says make L&D a profit center.
Yeah, and it's a great observation, and there are a few organizations. I think of PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, at least in Toronto. I don't know, there's a global organization, but I know a few people that work there in Toronto, and their entire thing, their entire way that they manage their L&D department is based on exactly that. It's how do we produce profit, and then ultimately how do we make it a profit center? And so it's rigmarole. To get approval for an L&D project is as difficult as getting approval for any other type of project, which really it should be, but in a lot of organizations it's not.
Right. Bradley says figure out what the profit paths are.
Yeah, and a great observation, Bradley, and that's really where we're going to take this conversation. Is how do we actually get to profit? Like if we don't, it's much easier to start from profit and work backwards than to start from a course and work towards profit. And I think that's often the problem, is we build the course and don't move towards profit, or we build the course and try and make it move towards profit rather than working from profit backwards if it's the end goal.
Kevin says understand the path to profit better.
L&D sometimes likes to hide in HR. Like we want to be trainers, or we want to be instructional designers, we want to be e-learning developers, and we don't want to do other things. But to be really effective at what we do, we have to understand the business. We have to understand how the business makes money, the things that cause it to lose money, the things that cause it to generate revenue or increase costs, and then we can start to align with that. I'm a big fan of L&D not living in HR. I think it's the absolute wrong place for L&D to live, that it should be much closer to the organization. So thanks for that, Brian. And I see David's comment here about assigning costs into other offerings. I'm not 100% sure what you mean by that. I'm going to try and interpret this, David, but please feel to jump in if I get that wrong. That the costs of training should actually live inside different departments. Ideally, the departments that are requesting it, and that they're actually paying the L&D team. They're paying for that production. And when you assign learning into the budgets of individual departments, that tends to have an impact on how they look at how much they'll ask for or what they're willing to pay for, and that conversation about how much to include becomes a fair bit simpler. Well, thanks very much for all of those questions, and I guess I'll finish off with this. This question, how does this get us to profit? And consider how this would change the types of conversations that you have inside your organizations if you ask this question inside the request meetings for training. When someone comes and says, we want customer service training, and asking the question, great, how does this get us to profit? And often that conversation is something that opens up other conversations that allows you to help determine whether or not training is actually required and which training is required. And if you're in a position that is as a developer or as an instructional designer and don't feel like you can ask this question, I'd encourage you to try it. I'd encourage you to press this type of question. There's nothing more rewarding for a leader or an executive when somebody pushes back and asks them to qualify, how is this going to happen? How is this going to make a difference for our organization? Those are the questions that they want to be asking, that they want individuals inside the organizations at all levels asking. And then this quote, I'm a big fan of, but I'm going to rip it off. People don't want to buy a 1/4-inch drill. They want a 1/4-inch hole. At the same time, we could say people don't want a 30-minute e-learning course. They want a business result. And that business result is always in some way tied to profit. So a great tool that you can use to help make sure that your e-learning courses are on the path to profit is the Major and Pipe Performance Analysis Flow Diagram. I'm going to pop that up here on the screen. It's way too small to read. You may be able to pick this up, but I broke it out into the 7 basic questions, or 7 core questions that come out of it. If you're unfamiliar with this, please go download it. It is a fantastic tool to have in your toolbox as an e-learning developer, designer, writer, whatever your role is. It's also really, really valuable in having conversations with individuals inside the organization. That question, how do we get to profit from here, or how do we get to profit, fits nicely right inside this set of questions. So this breaks down into 7 questions. You can obviously see them on screen. The first is, what's the performance problem, and is it worth pursuing? We often get caught in the it's a hot topic right now sort of situation as e-learning developers. We want something right now, but by the time we can even produce it, that hot topic has gone by, and it's not something that anyone wants to deal with anymore, or something else is the hot topic now. So it's a question worth asking whether or not it right now is the time. In the book that this diagram is actually from, the author actually makes this little quip along the lines of, sometimes the only problem that a situation is causing is the annoyance that it's causing someone else in the organization. And so working through a flow chart like this helps us avoid those situations where only 1 or 2 people really actually think that this is valuable. The next question then becomes, can we apply fast fixes? Sometimes just clarifying expectation, providing resources, providing feedback are enough to resolve a situation without having any training involved. Are the consequences appropriate? Consequences sometimes gets confused as a word. We're looking at both the negative and positive consequences here. Essentially, are people rewarded when they do a good job? And is there some sort of punishment or feedback mechanism for them when they don't do as well? Sometimes incentives are valuable for this. Sometimes incentives do the exact opposite of what we want them to do. If we can get through all of that, then we can start asking the question is whether or not there's actually a skill deficiency. Because when we look at training, and we've all heard this before, there's only 2 things that we can actually fix with training, and that is a knowledge or skill gap. And even then, it's not necessarily going to be the solution to use a training solution, even if there is a knowledge and skill gap. It's just one of the potential offerings. There could, of course, be other causes that need to be investigated. And then finally, which solutions are best? Sometimes training is the best solution, but sometimes it's coaching, sometimes it's mentoring, sometimes it's group discussions. So there's a lot of other options as well that are available for you. So when we start asking that question, how does this get us to profit? And we're talking about e-learning, this is just such an incredibly valuable tool. Can't encourage you enough to jump online and go and download this. Obviously, it's going to be in the presentation if you just want to steal it from there afterwards. But it's the Major and Pipe Performance Analysis Flow Diagram. And feel free to jump in if you have any questions about that one. So that sums up what I wanted to say about having the wrong focus. The challenge of having the wrong focus, or what it's done to us, I think is summed up really simply in this concept of the downward spiral. And it's not quite as cliche as the iceberg example, but it is still quite common if you've seen the downward spiral types of examples before. So this is our downward spiral, and it looks something like this. We get ourselves into a situation for a number of different reasons where we don't get the results that we're supposed to, or we can't prove the results that we were supposed to get, which means that we have to fight for buy-in as we go for other projects, or as we want to get support for the projects that we're working on. We often don't get enough budget as a result of fighting for buy-in, because to get budget, you need buy-in, as well as we find ourselves ending up under continuous pressure, as shown in that earlier comment. How long does it take to build a PowerPoint? Why can't this be done tomorrow? Subsequently, we also can't get the support that we need. And then we end up just doing the best that we can with what we've got, and ultimately we don't get results. And again, going back to that original question, if you don't agree with the premise, you may not agree with this downward spiral entirely. But if we work back up through it, is if you're in a position where you're having trouble getting the support that you need to produce results, if you find yourself under continuous pressure to produce, if you're not getting enough budget and you're complaining about not having enough buy-in, the only reason that these things happen is if we're not getting results. If we were getting results consistently from learning and development, organizations would consistently use it, consistently invest in it, and consistently give you the time and budget to do it properly. So if you're finding any of these, but you're disagreeing that we are getting, or you feel like we are getting results, you need to start questioning why no one else is seeing that, or what you need to do differently to promote that, because it is possible that we're getting results, but just not doing a good enough job promoting them, which would be a different presentation. So here's the question for the group: how do we break the downward spiral? And I'll go back to it, but putting that as the question, how do we interrupt it? How do we break it? And I'll put this up here again so you can see sort of the topics that I was discussing. Either what is the easiest place to interrupt this, or what is the best way to interrupt it? And we'll do about 60 seconds again.
Meanwhile, I would like to ask a quick question from David. He did not agree with what you said before. And he says, I think that if you make profit, meaning that profit should be the main purpose. He says, I think that if you make profit the central element, you are forgetting the real meaning of life. How do you explain this for nonprofit organizations?
So I would like to address both of those separately. David, thanks for bringing that up, and I agree with both of your comments. So I'm going to provide a slightly look at it from a slightly different angle, but first to say I agree with both of the things that you said there. One of the things that we have to be okay with is that a corporation, as a legal entity, specifically talking about businesses, its only objective is to make profit. It's not a living thing. It's strictly a legal entity. So from an organizational perspective, while it's maybe not the most inspiring thing, and it's maybe not the most altruistic thing, ultimately that's what organizations have to do to survive. Just the same as a human being needs to breathe, eat, and drink. Those are sort of the fundamental tenets of us being able to survive. An organization has to make profit. And so when we talk to CFOs or CEOs inside organizations, ultimately that's what they're most concerned with. Now, when we talk about not-for-profit organizations, sometimes the word profit and then nonprofit becomes a bit of a misnomer to deal with. Nonprofit organizations still need to make a profit. They still need to create revenue somehow, whether that's through fundraising or sales or anything of that nature. And they also want to reduce costs as much as possible so that their profit margin exists, because that profit is what allows them to do the most good in the world. So for a not-for-profit organization, I would say that profit may not be the end goal, because ultimately we want to do something with that profit, but is the ability to get that profit that allows a not-for-profit organization to be successful, to operate, and to create the good in the world that they want to create. I have a good friend who works for Plan International in Toronto, the Canadian branch, and we've had this discussion a number of times that unless they are successful in creating profit, running their business or their organization efficiently, they can't create the good that they want to create. So I hope that agrees with what you're saying, David, but you're absolutely right. The idea here isn't that we should sell our souls and only ever focus on profit as L&D. The assertion is that needs to be the starting point, what we focus on at the start of a project and work backwards to the project that we're going to develop as e-learning developers or instructional designers. And when we do that, we're often going to find the line becomes blurry at some point. We may not have the statistics that we need or the measurements that we need to produce an ROI at the end of it. But what it does give us when we're dealing with leaders is that we put them in that mind frame, we put ourselves in that mind frame, and the felt impact of the training tends to increase as a result, trying to interrupt this spiral a bit. And I saw some things that were popping up and then disappeared. That question. Thanks, David. That question about how do we break this? And Virginia, makes the comment, align L&D goals with specific company goals. I love that comment. It's spot on. The struggle that I have with that one specifically, Virginia, is that it's become almost cliche. Like when we talk about business goals, and the word specific in there is really important though. If we can be really clearly identify like what's on the strategic plan for the year for the organization and align to that, that's fantastic. Knowing that the strategic plan will always lead towards profit, or that's going to be the discussion ultimately. How do we grow? How do we scale? How do we produce more revenue with less cost? That sort of thing. So yeah, it's finding that alignment. But for L&D to do that, we actually need to get closer to the business and understand the business better. Often we don't understand it clearly enough to be able to make decisions about alignment and to push back when we're training on things that don't make sense. And that is some of our problem from that comment. Sorry, I forgot who it was earlier that said, that mentioned the 80-20 rule. It's really difficult for us to push back and say that something isn't in the most valuable 20% if we don't understand the business well enough. And Brad, your comment about wanting to be inside the value stream. If anyone's a lean practitioner or Six Sigma, continuous improvement in general, understanding the value stream and what is a value add versus a non-value add in relation to training. Often what we're producing isn't creating value for the organization. Like quite literally, it's a non-value added activity. So unless we find ways to attach it to the value, that becomes a challenge for us. All right, so let's carry on and move in to here. So this is, Virginia, I apologize. This might also be offensive. So you didn't like the way that first question was worded. Fair comment. It is more difficult on a webinar just for you to see my body language and hand movements and commentary. I like to be cheeky, and this is one of those things that I'll add on to this. This is one of L&D's challenges right now, I believe, and it's that we spend too much time believing our own hype. And what I mean by that is that we read our own books, we go to read our own blogs, we go listen to our own podcasts, watch our own YouTube videos, we go to our own conferences. It's a lot of L&D people talking to L&D people about L&D things, telling each other how good we are and how we can fix things and how we're a strategic differentiator inside organizations. And we sometimes get caught up in believing that we're really, really important or really good. And often that's the argument that L&D is making inside organizations. We can make a difference. But what we haven't done is actually proved it. And so when I say don't believe your own hype, or don't believe our own hype as a group, it's don't believe that learning is important. Don't believe that L&D or e-learning is intrinsically valuable on its own, because it's not. What is valuable is when we actually make a change to the organization. And I just saw Virginia, the comment pop up that says, how would you prove it? Sorry, can you qualify what it is, if you don't mind? Change inside the organization. Great question, and the type of thing that we could spend an entire session on. It really depends on the type of change that you're trying to drive. If you're familiar at all with 4 disciplines of execution, and this is for everyone, if you're not familiar with 4 disciplines of execution, I should say, go pick up that book. You may not be interested in the 40X model specifically, but what the 4 disciplines of execution does a really fantastic job of is identifying lead measures. And lead measures, even in the business world, sometimes still get misconstrued with leg measures. So a leg measure are the results, like your actual business metrics that get printed off, and we can't go back in time and change them. They're just done. They're lagging. They come after the fact. Where your lead measures are the measures that happen before the fact. They're the things that are predictive of and influenceable of something that's going to happen in the future. So when we talk about changes, one of the things, or behavior changes specifically, one of the things that we want to look for are those lead measures. What are the things that the organization would bet on as making a change, or making a valuable change to the organization if people did them consistently? And so again, those 2 qualities, they need to be predictive of that happening, and they need to be influenceable, meaning that a person needs to have some control over them. Obviously, better weather is good for farmers. That's a lead measure of a good crop at the end of the year. Unfortunately, it's not influenceable in any way. So we're looking for inside the organizations the things that are both predictive and influenceable, and something that we can monitor. And sometimes to get these types of things, we actually have to go out on the floor and sit with people and see what they're doing and confirm, confirming that they're actually performing something, which also becomes challenging, no question there is, but that that's one thing that that L&D does very little of, or seems to do very little of, is actually going out and monitoring those behaviors. It's one of the most fantastic ways to be able to quantify that we've made a change, especially if the organization has agreed that they want that behavior to be used. All right, and so we've got about 7 minutes left before we dive into Q&A at the end. The last thing that I want to talk about is this idea of standalone solutions. And this is frustrating, to say the very least, because this is how most e-learning courses still get built. We like to think of it this way. There's a problem, we give some e-learning, and then we get a result. But even if we talk to businesses or e-learning developers, generally in this discussion, we know this doesn't work. If it were possible to give somebody a 30-minute e-learning course, and that would change performance inside the organization in a meaningful way or a measurable way, every organization would do it every single week because it works. The reason that we don't do it is because it doesn't work like this. More often than not, we're pushing to get the e-learning out because for compliance reasons, and all we really need is the check mark. In that case, the e-learning does its job. But as far as actually making results or changing the organization in a meaningful way, it doesn't typically happen like this. What we need to do is start thinking about the pre and the post activities that accompany the e-learning. And when we think of an e-learning course, often that the reason we're having it is because of time differences and wanting to eliminate these other components, the pre and the post. If you want to create change inside your organization, these things are required, because a 30-minute course has never changed an organization in a meaningful way. And that's a discussion that you need to start having with the people inside your organization about what you're going to do before the e-learning to support it, after the e-learning to support it. If you're familiar with Beyond the Transfer of Training by Mary L. Broad, that is a fantastic book. She has large charts talking about the types of things you can do before and after training to get this type of support. But in this case, we're still looking at e-learning as the primary solution, but e-learning has so many other ways that we can apply it. One of them is to support instructor-led training as well. So e-learning could be your pre and post activities. A type of course that I've actually built in this format was for motivational interviewing. If you're unfamiliar with motivational interviewing, it has its roots in addiction, but it's actually a behavior change model to support people making change for themselves. And the way that we had set this up was a brief introductory course, so really brief, like 20 minutes on instructor-led training, on the instructor-led training about motivational interviewing. Then we had 2 half days of instructor-led training, and then once every 2 weeks, there was a short e-learning course on one of the things from the instructor-led training. So giving somebody even a bunch of content over 2 days can be ineffective, especially when it's a skill that needs to be practiced. And so every 2 weeks, an e-learning course would come out on one of those particular skills, which would also have a takeaway from it that the participants would complete for themselves. They'd actually perform it after completing interviews. They were safety counselors, so with some of the drivers that they were working with, and then they would come together as a group and discuss what they had experienced based on that individual item. So the term that gets thrown around is as blended. A blended training solution is what this would often be described as. The impetus here, I think is really important as far as creating e-learning that is valuable and is meaningful to the organization, is to get away from this notion that e-learning is its standalone tool and finding the right way for it to live. The flip side of this may be that you have some other type of pre-course, and then your instructor-led training, and then your e-learning that follows it. And then potentially, and we hear this one referred to often as micro-learning, is a series of drip release or intermittent spaced content that gets delivered to the learner, which is a fantastic tool, again, particularly if you're looking at an operational environment. And that's the one thing to really comment on this particular model when we talk about micro-learning, or if we talk about spaced retrieval, is that organizations that are operational and don't have as much time to take people away from the job benefit from this the most. So if you work in that type of environment, it's great to start asking that question: how do we get smaller pieces of training more frequently? There's a whole bunch of brain science reasons that we should be doing that, but operationally, that's what your organization is going to listen to. If you try and sell this to them on the brain science, they're going to tune out. If you try and sell it to them on not interrupting the operation, so you can try and improve their employees and they can still do their work, that's something that's going to resonate. And speaking that language in general, anytime you start speaking the language of profit, you start speaking the language of the business.
Thank you so much, Clint. Wow, I think that's a lot of information to process, and I would like to thank you one more time for being the guest speaker for our audience. We very much appreciate it, and I hope that you guys enjoyed this session. And I think right now we are ready to switch back to the Q&A session.